Welcome everyone to this working paper presentation. May I request everyone except the speakers to please keep your microphones on mute for the duration of the meeting. Any queries or comments that you have may be typed into the chat box. They will be read out after the speaker and speaker's presentation and the discussant's comments. I request Professor G. Arunima to please take over the proceedings.
On behalf of the Kerala Council for Historical Research, we are delighted to welcome all of you to the working paper presentation series, which is kickstarting today with Aparna Ishwaran's talk, Speaking in Many Tongues. Aparna completed her PhD and she defended her thesis in 2018 from the Center for Women's Studies in JNU. The same year, she was awarded a fellowship by the Kerala Council for Historical Research to revise her thesis into a book. The paper that she's presenting today is a part of that fellowship that was awarded to her, and this is one of the expectations that the KCHR has of our fellows who are granted this fellowship. So we are very happy that not only has Aparna managed to do a first draft of her revision, but also that she is here today to present this work so that we can actually learn and discuss this paper. She was additionally awarded a postdoctoral fellowship by the Indian Council for Social Science Research in 2019. And that postdoctoral fellowship continues her work that she had started on war poetry in Sri Lanka and looking at women poets, but it extends the scope of that research. We are also very honored to have Dr. V. Padma, known to a large number of us as Mangai, a very well-known writer, playwright, and theatre activist and feminist from Tamil Nadu. She will actually respond to Aparna's paper today. But before we start today's proceedings, I want us to remember a great scholar and a very dear friend, somebody who's part of our lives as part of not just the scholarly community, but the large world of the women's movement and women's friendships. Professor Malati Dialvis, a Sri Lankan scholar, a social anthropologist from Sri Lanka, who has done profoundly serious work in the past 3 decades. She passed away this morning at 1 a.m. after having battled cancer for the past 3 years. Mala's passing has been heartbreaking for large numbers of us who were lucky to have counted her as one of our friends. We also learned enormously from her work on motherhood, her work with Kumari Jayawardena, on looking at the mothers' movement in Sri Lanka, and also her very, very layered and nuanced work on violence, where she brought all kinds of new insights, including in her more recent work, thinking about the visual in relation to violence. So please let us take 1 minute to remember Mala on this day when we have our paper presentation on Sri Lankan war poetry. Could we start now, Aparna?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, KCHR, for this opportunity. And thank you, Professor Arunima, for that introduction. I just got to know about passing away of Maldi De Alvis, whom I know through my mentor and supervisor, G. Arunima. And I had met her when I had gone to Sri Lanka, and it is really shocking for me. Okay. So the paper that I'm going to present here today is titled Speaking in Many Tongues, the Articulation of Violence in the Poetry by Tamil Women in Sri Lanka. Let me at the onset make my positionality and my identity very visible. I'm a researcher from Kerala with very tenuous links to Tamils in Sri Lanka. I'm led to this work with poetry, thinking and forming ideas based on research and writings coming mostly from the vernacular medium, marginalized in the academia and through thinkers and researchers and academicians, still writing from the space of violence, with continuously pecking at them. So I'm an outsider of the language and the experience, and this work is thus a work of translation with all its inherent pitfalls. Secondly, the historical period that is held to scrutiny in this paper is bookended by two brutal events of erasure. The years that are between 1981 and 2009. On June 1st, 1981, the famous Jaffna Public Library was set on fire by the police forces of Sri Lanka. The library, which housed 97,000 volumes, innumerable manuscripts, and invaluable archival material, was reduced to a pile of ash. Between a sunset and the next sunrise, an important part of the cultural history of the Tamil people was incinerated. As if to confirm Heinrich Heine's words, where they have burned books, they will end in burning human beings. A period of much bloodshed and violence followed this brutal act of arson. Terrible atrocities were committed on the civilian population of Sri Lanka through the next 30 years of civil war by both parties involved in the war, the Sri Lankan state forces and the LTTE. The scale and nature of this conflict reached its horrific zenith in the period between January 2009 and May 2009, at the end of which the Sri Lankan government declared its victory over LTTE. The final stage of the war, which came to a bloody halt in Mullawaikal, was infamously dubbed by the media as a war without witness. However, poetry as a mode of witnessing war can be traced in the works written by Tamil during the period. Since the publication of the widely read Maranthul Varvum, published in 1983, We Will Live Amidst Death, which inaugurated what could be called a genre of poetry of political protest, which included poets like Cheran, Jayapalan, Aravindan, and Ahilan. Various anthologies and collections of poems have appeared in Sri Lanka written by Tamils. The poetry produced in this period is marked by the important events during the war and the active writing through it. Yet, these poems are not ordinary records of important events. It is a collection of multiple responses, differing views, different experiences that shun the objectivity of a singular history. It also bears the struggles of confronting a world marked with the brutality as well as banality of wartime violence. My work tries to locate poetry as being in conversation with the various experiences that marks an existence through a war, which was usually and frequently termed as being fought over competing nationalism. I ask, how does poetry act as a witness to women's experience of war in the period 1981 to 2009, a period which is also crucial to the Tamil nationalist movement? However, the past has to be witnessed through the prism of the present, and the present in Sri Lanka is not devoid of violence. Though the war was brutally brought to an end, the violence faced by Tamils and Muslims in Sri Lanka still continues. One of the insidious ways in which the violence has been perpetuated is through the deliberate acts of erasure of the history of Tamil people's struggle and through official interdictions on memory and remembering. The wounds have not healed. In fact, it has not been allowed to be healed with intentional, insensitive displays of power, literally bulldozing monuments in memories of the hurt and the marginalized. A person or a community devoid of memory and history and identity, as poets note, are walking corpses, already dead. Yalini Yogeshwaran, poet from Jaffna in the post-war period, writes poignantly in Udaru, ask them if they know. The story which they claim has ended before. Many episodes and subplots of it still exist here. She continues to write, even if I am dead, give me back my identity alive. Give me back my identity alive, and I shall survive. But sadly, it is exactly the erasure of identity which is the violence faced by Tamils in Sri Lanka today. The end of the war meant a century of another sort in the name of moving on and a rhetoric of development. The burden again fell on the Tamils to forget the past, to accept reconciliation and move on so that Sri Lanka can concentrate on rebuilding and economic development. Tamils' right to remember their suffering and loss has been taken away from them in an insensitive and flagrant erasure of any remnants of the violent past that they suffered, which is termed by Sumati Shivamohan, artist, poet, and academician, as the aesthetics of triumphalism. For example, the massacre ground in the last days of war in Nandikadal Lagoon today houses a resort called the Lagoon's Edge. The war bunkers, the home of erstwhile LTT Supremo Prabhakaran, were turned into army sites as well as tourist sites, with soldiers offering tea and samosas. This prompted Gauri Kuneshwaran, a queer Tamil American poet, performing artist, teacher, and lawyer whose family immigrated to the US from Sri Lanka, write a poem titled How to Enjoy a Vacation to a Country That Says It Won the War. The poem is written in forms of bullet points, a few of which I shall read. She writes, while planning your journey, accept that ethics are not included in the price of your ticket. Tell yourself your currency is helping the country. Do not question government control of the tourism industry. Never ask why killing fields have been converted into resorts run by the military. Learn the dominant language, which translates war criminals into heroes. And she ends by saying, define tourist as none of this involves me. Take photos of every sunset. Always have your passport handy. Keep your conscience secure in the hotel safe. It has to be noted that the systemic destruction was not just of LTT memorials or Tuilum Illams, but also the statues, the pillars, gardens constructed by local residents, the civilians, to remember civilian deaths, remember their loved ones. These were also destroyed, the latest being the sudden demolition of a memorial in the Jaffna University campus at the start of this year, which was created to remember Tamil civilians killed during the last part of the war. Sindhujan Varadaraja, an upcoming academician from Germany, writes, our past became a subaltern memory and an antagonist history. Where does such memory go to rest? But even in this moment of erasure of identity, the burden was on the Tamils to make peace. There were widespread concerns that the Tamils revisiting and remembering the horrors of the past will lead to a revival of the militant nationalism. Recently, in an online interview given to Nam Tamil radio channel, poet Avvai had recited an unpublished poem of hers titled Pudai Kurigal, or Burial Pits. She read, roads devoid of people, dense forest, thorny bushes, ditches, and hill valleys, abandoned wells are all renamed and have become burial pits. The disappeared, the abducted, the lovers of liberation, the descenders have become the buried bodies. She continues to write, those who have lost everything their curses shall slaughter. Those who have lost everything, their curses shall slaughter. A listener immediately responded, saying we shouldn't go back and talk about what happened and thereby escalate violence. To which Avai had calmly responded, this is our history. We can forgive, but we cannot forget. It is here, in this moment of continuing violence in the present, that we listen to the poetry of witness written by women, which are registers and texts of memory which articulate violence not just in its spectacular, horrific, and bloody excess of killing and murdering, but also in its everydayness, in its banal repetitiveness, in its utter lack of meaning. An articulation of violence as the structuring, the spine behind being Tamil in a majoritarian Sinhala Buddhist Sri Lanka. Here, violence is, of course, encountered in its debilitating force, capable of annihilating everything in a blink of an eye, but also in its slow eating away of at the soul, in the daily defeats it serves. But mostly, in this poetry of witness, violence is also constituting new identities, leading to the inauguration of new modes of survival, of resistance, determined smuggling of dissent and selfhood by determined smuggling of dissent and selfhood by forming new safer spaces, new ways of solidarity. Let me start with the period between 1981 to 1987, which saw the Tamils suffer from unspeakable violence, including the infamous 1983 anti-Tamil riots termed as Black July. This was, however, also a period of mass joining in the Tamil movements, the Iyakkam, and hence was marked with a sense of optimism and assertion of Tamil identities. In the imagination of a homeland, Eram, there were active debates and discussion on the nature of the polity, the culture, the gender relations, which will occupy this new construct, waiting to be formed. Led by the youth, the time was imbued with a vigor and a fearlessness emblematic of youthful energy and is marked by the reimagination of Tamil society, even as it is engulfed in violence from outside. Women join nationalist movements like Eros, LTT, Plot, EPLRF, among many other groups. There was independent women's groups were formed. A lot of new women's magazines were being published. It was a period of hope and energy and vigor. As Sumati Shivamohan writes, the national liberation struggle destabilized hierarchical structures of class, caste, and particularly gender at this point. Here, she traces the formation of a space for militant consciousness to emerge, which she opposes to the militarism of the later 1980s when LTTE comes into dominance. It was this period that produced in 1986 an important anthology of women poets titled Sollada Sedigal, edited by Citralega Maunaguru, who herself is a poet writing under different pseudonyms of Shankari and Chandrika. She will go on to be known as an exceptional academician, a professor in Eastern University, known equally for her activism as well as her interventions in peace and her writings. Her nuanced exploration of gender and the figure of woman in Tamil nationalism has been the bedrock on which this work could even begin. The anthology brought together 13 women poets, some of them who became well known in the following years, like Urvashi, Selvi, Shivaramani, Sanmarga, Avvai, among others. Maunaguru writes in the introduction to this collection that this work espouses a new awareness by women of themselves, their bodies, their lives, and their role in society. This literary production was facilitated by women's movements attached to the growth of national movements, as I mentioned earlier. The Pengal Arvattam, or the Women's Study Circle, composing of women in and around Jaffna University, provided an atmosphere of discussion and debate. As V. Geeta writes, in this anthology, we can trace an emergence of a tentative feminism arching its way out of a blasted yet dramatic space. It is very interesting because I was listening to the interview by Avvai, and she had mentioned how women were both part of these study circles and women's only groups, and they would have these intense debates where nothing was out of bounds. They would have intense debates and they would take whatever they had discussed to the respective movements they were part of, where again there will be debate and dissent, and they'll bring back whatever they have and the arguments they have encountered there to sharpen their argument better. She talks about how Citralekha Maunarguru had come out with a small pamphlet where in Tamil, translated into Tamil was feminist text, and it was sort of, they took it to the Nallur temple and distributed among common people, and then listened to their reactions, and then came back and decided and debated on how to tackle these concerns or sometimes misconceptions. So in the poems that are included in this in Sollada Seidigal, we can trace an effort in listening closely to the language of silence and turning those unspoken things to active speaking beings. Most of these poems are written in first person and have voices of women who are speaking of the inconsistencies underneath the deceptive, even surface of the Tamil society at that time, united in the purpose of Tamil nation. For example, A. Shankari, in her poem In Their Eyes, sets the tone to the collection. This is the first poem, and writes, I have no face, heart, soul. In their eyes, two breasts, long hair, slight waist, broad hips is all I have. Cooking, spreading beds, bearing children are my task. They will talk about chastity of Kannagi, and while they talk so, they'll keep on looking at my body. This is habitual, starting from husband to shopkeeper. The evocation of Kannagi in this poem is very pertinent considering the cultural currency that this figure from the Tamil epic Silapadikaram has in the Tamil society. She is the icon of the ideal Tamil womanhood who takes on a Pandyan king and questions him on justice and burns the city of Madurai in revenge for her husband's unjust death because of the purity of her chastity. Purity or katpu of woman is the cornerstone of Tamil cultural and moral regulation in constructing who is the ideal Tamil woman, especially in the future Elam. Sumati Shivamohan writes that the understanding of Katpa in Sri Lanka is mediated and received from various cultural and popular mediums like South Indian cinema, including South Indian cinema. She traces to Kannagi an antecedent to the notion of Katpa, which is later used to mobilize women into Tamil nationalism. In Jaffna society, Kannagi, she says, is not regarded as a real woman, but a saintly figure as well as a goddess. Yet, her Katpa, that characteristic is considered unmythical, real, which real women should also emulate. Sumati Shivamohan rightly opines that the martial revenge of Kannagi on the city of Madurai is conveniently forgotten and the mythical power of chastity is remembered and propagated. Throughout the poems, for example, Ranga's poem Unmailum Unmayai, which talks of sexual violence of a woman at the hands of a man who belongs to her same Ura. Uravin, Ur has me, which means natal village, carries connotation of home into as well, an assumption of shared love and affinity, which is what Ranga was attacking or taking to question the fixity of this idea, which was being dismantled through the words of the woman who was undergone rape from an Uravan. The truth, which is more than truth, that she says, is that the truth that exceeds the common sense of community, the unspeakability of violence against women that's inherent within communities. The poems also are sometimes take a very affective tone. They're addressed to missing lovers, but they always end with a feminist consciousness. For example, Shankari's Idaiveli, which is the poem starts addressing the lover but ends by saying, what can I do? I'm a woman liberated. How can you reach the heights I occupy? Or Avvai's Oru Thozhiyin Kural, which reminds us of that one enlightened friend we have who badgers us to wake up and see the light, where she says, why are you still in the dark? She say, "Irundu va, ulage par, see the world." Maitreyi talks of how tags like chaste, people saying that, oh, how chaste you are, like Kannagi, or how good you cook, the cooking star, or how thin and beautiful are you are. She says these are not praises, these are golden chains, please, woman. See it for what it is. Um, so this was written in the 1980s, and when after almost 21 years, another more comprehensive anthology of women poets, Pale Manakkum Poluthu from Ilang, which was painstakingly collected and published at the height of war in Sri Lanka by A. Mangai. She writes of Sollada Sedigal as putting forward women's voice in a different tonality and interweaving of the personal with the political. So while the women are sometimes talking of deeply personal memories and experiences, they're always simultaneously talking of the outside political violence as well. In the afterword to the same anthology, V. Geeta terms this as the interweaving of the Thinais, the Agam and the Puram, and examining the inner work, which is basically examining the inner workings of the outer world and the outer tremors of the inner world. She traces an absence of the same in the writings of women coming from Tamil Nadu at that period. However, she says the later generation of women starting to write during the 2000s, especially about body politics and deeply political in their outlook, has what she called a Nannikkadan, or a debt of thanks to give to Sollada Sedigal. In 1990s, with the past struggle between militant groups yielding to dominance of a single militant group, which is ILTT, the poetry of women also changed in its tenor. On one hand, there was the poetry of women combatants like Ambuli, Captain Bharati, Captain Vanadi, etc., and which was marked by the persistence of heroism. It is interesting as they wrote of what moved them to shoulder guns, and like V. Geeta says, writes. Also talks about the tragic freedom that they experienced, which was linked to their abilities to wield guns. This is even in the poetry which is published afterward, like Unnamed Star, Peridada Natchattirangal. Also, you can see there's a lot of things that the combatant women talk about. It's not usually there is, I'll get to that point. So there is a very engaging debate on the agency of women combatants, which I don't want to get into right now. But in the reasons given for women turning into wielders of violence, especially as part of the elite Black Tiger Suicide Squad, there were insinuations that this must be because she has gone through sexual violence. So basically saying the violence embodies the woman with a subjectivity that demands revenge and more violence. I fall back on the nuanced analysis provided by Citralekha Maunaguru on the construct of the raped woman that at once evidences Tamil society's moral anxiety to protect and police women's body, but also at the same time shows the helplessness encountered by civilians by the rampant use of sexual violence as an instrument of war. Nilofer Demel has done extensive work on it. She talks how she does address the morality of LTTE and their injunctions on women's sexuality, but she also talks about how when Danu, who killed Rajiv Gandhi, there were rumors going around that she was a rape victim of the IPKF. Maunaguru equates this revenge story with the ritual of Agni Pravesham, or what she calls self-purification. So the self-purification for the raped woman to be an ideal Tamil woman again would be to erase herself through taking revenge. This was also the period that we as Indians should be deeply ashamed of, the period when IPKF under the garb of peacekeeping was a perpetrator of another deeply sexual of violence of all nature, which led to people ex-combatants like Banu Bharati write very difficult to read poems like Vedi Kundipisaham Pandavar and Kala's Konnishwarigal. These are all difficult readings because we come to face the violence we are capable of in wartime. Konnishwari was a Tamil woman gang raped and murdered by security forces in 1997 in Ampere district. She was visited by security forces at her house, and after the brutal rape was killed by throwing a grenade into her genitals. And it's the same violence given in graphic detail that we can see in Kala's Konnishwarigal, also. But what I was interested in was how there is a plurality of or a community of women being thought about, with the center being the woman who has been violated. So it's not a Kunnishwari, but it's Kunnishwarigal. And here I'm drawn to Aryal's excellent poem Mannam Perigal, which I want to read out. It is okay. We have seen it on many mornings during our frequent travels at the edges of street fences or at the intersection of four roads. It takes many forms, shape shifting into dog, bear, or wolf, eagle, cat, or buffalo. With its lifted leg beside a telegraph post, it stares at me. It must be many days since that animal slept. Its eyes speak aloud of a creature unknown to me. The avid hunger in those eyes make me aware of an unknown tongue. I, a refugee in this country, walk past, telling myself that this must be the violent language that beautiful Mannemperi and Kunneshwari heard, recognized. In the midst of my sleep that night, after the day's frenzied roaming and its mental anguish, I too recognized the very same deeply embedded language of violence. Beside me, my husband lay, his breath cooling. Uh, So in these poems, the rape of the woman has led to a speech which cannot be simply accommodated within the registers of revenge. Instead of exclusion and spectrality of the lone raped woman, the multiplicities of violence and responses are highlighted. In the poems, the writers identify themselves with the violated woman. This especially at a time when acknowledgement of sexual violence was very difficult in Sri Lanka, and when it was also, the attacks were sometimes also message crimes, as said in Subhan's anthology. Message crimes in the sense that warning women by deliberate attacks, by attacking women who have joined movements. It's basically saying the woman who joins the movements will be raped. I want to read this along with Tamilini's memoir. Tamilini, who headed LTT's Women's Political Division. Her memoir is titled In the Shadow of the Sword. There has been acknowledgement in international fact-finding missions, Human Rights Commission reports, etc., that rampant use of sexual violence was committed in the torture of the surrendered Tamils at the end of the war, in the immediate end of the war. Thammarini, however, denies that she had to go through any of this such violence, and she in fact talks about the ill effects of such insinuation that women under detention has had to go through sexual violence, and how it adversely affects the life of the woman who gets out. She's also deeply hurt at the society which couldn't come to terms with the surrendered combatant. The society which kept asking her why didn't she bite the cyanide capsule after, quote, what she had to go through. So here what you see is that either you speak out and become and speak out or take revenge, or you erase yourself. While I was reading this, I thought it was the vestiges of LTT's morality surviving in Tamil's denial of violence. But then I read Shivati Shumohan talk of how silence or denial of sexual violence is not always victimhood. She terms this refusal to acknowledge the violence one has been subjected to as the untelling of the act, a choice that reveals the violence committed by the society on women before and after the act. So even the act of not telling is as a political act. She also draws upon the work she has done on women who surrendered at the end of the war, and also Tamil Kavi's novel called Urikalam, where the last days of war, the journey from what was their home to their enemy's territory is mapped out. Women had to have talked about walking naked, relieving themselves on the seashores, but it's shown as an act of survival, of gazing back. There is no shame, but this is an active act of survival. She contrasts this with the war footages of trophy videos taken by Sinhala soldiers of mutilated bodies like that of Isapriya, who was in the press wing of LTT. Similarly, at the same time, there was also a tract of poetry which recognized the tragic and violent turn of the national struggle in its militant phase. We see how violence is noted as a loss of control over one's time. There is a there is a um, the women are trying to uh, conceptualize wartime as also a temporal shift that was hard to adapt to but more difficult to explain. Poetry with its lack of narrative closure became the chosen medium. For example, Shivaramani's very famous poem Oppressed by Nights of War marks the time of war through the changes in the experiences of childhood, where she says that how um, children have forgotten to play hopscotch and to make temple carts from palm fruit shells. But now what they learn is to shut the gate in good time and to listen when the dogs bark strangely. Maitri's poem talks about this mother who who whose husband has gone missing or has disappeared, and how she has to leave, um, make sure that the doors are closed, but make sure also that um, the door behind is sometimes left open. And how can she talk about how these reversal of circumstances has happened to a young child. Urvashi's poem called Their Night, where she graphically describes the pain of witnessing an event like the capture of a loved one. She talks about the loss of their days and nights as being claimed by violence. So she says how when the lover is taken away, the child, it's very disturbing narration. The child at my feet screamed, neighbors gathering in curiosity. He walked away with them, and she continues to say, the impression made in me by the hands bearing 50 rifles made a burden of sorrow. That night was theirs. Um, this was also the period of the exodus of Muslims from their homes in northern Sri Lanka, termed as traitors, leading to poetry of displacement and hurt coming to full force in the 2000s. In the Sri Lankan war, there were impossibilities of return for the Muslims. Um, in October 1990, LTT had forcefully evicted about 70,000 to 80,000 Muslims from the north in their effort to create Tamilam. You see how Sharmila said in her poignantly notes the losses suffered and the impossibility of return in a poem Keys to an Empty House, where the house is no more, but the keys are still held on by her father. Anar writes of the pain of being termed a traitor, which is there in Pale Manakumbudhu in that anthology. Anar writes about how certain losses which are so intangible, like she says how my sister's laugh was like a bird in flight, and she goes on to say that her um she does that laughter has never been heard again because of war. Mm. Um, I now want to come to the last session of my paper, which is about dissent and dissenters and their death, and how a poetry of remembrance has come about or around them. For example, Rajani Tiranagama, um, who was an early supporter of LTT but parted ways with the organization in the mid 1980s. She was harassed both by the Sri Lankan army and the IPKF. Though Rajani knew her life was at risk, she refused to be cowed down or leave Jaffna. She co-authored the very important book Broken Palmyra and the important, still quoted and still studied chapter No More Tears Sister, which is a feminist appraisal of the conflict. She co-founded the University Teachers for Human Rights, Jaffna, and her assassination was the intolerance that a militant organization has shown to a woman who shows the courage to express her convictions. It there is poetry that has come out of her death by Avai and many others. Then there's the dissent, which is you see in the poetry by Selvi Tyagarajan, who was a former member of Plot. She was arrested. She was and disappeared without any much evidence. Um, then Shivaramani was a powerful voice which came from Jaffna and was part of Sullada Sedigal, and how when the militant struggle started eating itself and then fighting for dominance in the IPKF war, what happened was that there was a retreat into misogynist thinking, even in spaces of education, where feminists were being targeted, and there were posters, misogynist posters, which came across university campus trying to police the dress code of women students, condemning feminists and feminism. Shivaramani was also personally targeted. So this this brilliant woman who had written "Come Friends, Let's Win the World" at the start of the Tamil national movement now writes, "We got up not to change the world, but to enter another darkness." So there is a fatigue and ennui that marks both Selvi's poems and Shivaramani's poems, which I turned to Valentine Daniels' work on newly freed victims of terror in Sri Lanka, where he says that brutalities were wearisomely enumerated in flat-toned recitations devoid of conviction. It was not actually boredom or but it was an overwhelming sense of sheer worthlessness of all attempts to communicate something which was so radically individuated and rendered as unshareable. And it is the unshareability which is also again that we see in Shivaramani's and Selvi's poems. uh, but but what is interesting is how, again, something that is flagged for us in Pale Manakkum Poluthu, the afterwards there, where they talk about how the uh, personal memories are intertwined with the larger, but talking about the larger political context. And so you see how even when Avai is writing about Rajini, or Sumati Shivamohan is writing about Shivaramani, you see that there's a painful drawing of memories and thinking about the time that they spent together, etc. But then it is again a vehement act of dissent in itself at a time when there was a lot of censorship. Um, Recently, the FemCon Sri Lanka Collective, an online and on-ground platform for facilitating intersectional and intergenerational feminist conversations, had held a panel discussion to pay tribute to notable Sri Lankan feminist personalities of the past, very aptly titled "Looking Back, Looking Ahead." To interest to this paper was how noted activist Sarala Emmanuel, who works with the Surya Women's Development Center, a collective of women's activists working in Batticaloa district in eastern Sri Lanka, on a remembrance of Rajini, emphasized on her everyday interventions in war as doctor, as an activist, as well as a work in solidarity and friendship building and trust. So violence is also, it is acknowledged, it is condemned, but also newer versions or newer ways of solidarity buildings that these women were involved in are recognized and are made visible. So she says how the work that Rajini had done, and Shanti Sachidanandan had done, had then later on has repercussions in say forming of Kutra of Surya Development Center. um, Very interestingly, from in her remembrance, she talks about her work with this organization she's a part of, called Tamil Muslim Sinhala Sisters, and their interventions after the widespread violence against Muslims after the Easter Sunday attack. We know that after the war, Muslims were the first minorities to bear the brunt of it. The Bodhubala Sena had a anti halal agitation. There was riots in Alatkuma, and then after the Easter Sunday attack, they were widespread violence against them. She talks of how in the wake of this violence, there was also rumors that infertility drugs were being put in their food. Then TMS sisters, she says how they came together and they cooked together. They made more or buttermilk and offered to devotees walking to Mamangan temple. Interventions in how people lived in every day. And she says how to see the difference between, how do we conceptualize the difference between the sacred and the profane in such context. I found it very profound that like this was what a remembrance of a feminist has led to everyday interventions. The period of militant nationalism was also marked by displacement. I don't want to get into that too much. Women have written. Poetry has been written by women in diaspora, talking about the difficult middle passage, the violence of having to bear the burden of carrying the nation, and being the ideal Tamil women. Um, but also again the emergence of different solidarities like Pengal Sandipigal, which Mankamam can talk um, uh, um, with more knowledge, which was starting in 1990s, and the publications they brought out. I remember this one poem written by Arial, and this note that Deva had written at the called Suvadugal in Meal Parvagal, and Ariel writing, I recognize in the marks and bruises of on all women the whiplash scar on my mother's face. So how, an act of solidarity building and sisterhood is also a part of tackling how tackling things about mm, violence. I want to end my paper with a very small um, thinking through on abductions and disappearances, because it's a different predicament. There is no closure. People are still waiting for information. Here I had looked at Maldi De Alvis's work, her article titled Tracing the Absent Presence, which suggests that a re-inhabiting of the world in the context of forced disappearances is a constant tracing of traces, given the ambiguous nature of the disappeared status of absence and thus presence. She compares Lacapra's and Butler's idea of grief. Lacapra is concerned that allowing oneself to be caught up in the thrall of one's own grief is intellectually unproductive. But Butler, on the other hand, traces space for politics in the relational undoing in grief. As De Alvis notes in this essay, this undoing is both physical and psychical. At the same time as we struggle for the autonomy of our bodies, we are also confronted by the fact that we carry the enigmatic traces of others. Maldi De Alvis, following her reading of Butler, points to the possibility of reconsidering her earlier work on political communities being formed under the aegis of motherhood, and look at how political communities can be formed around grief. And that is exactly what Mothers of the Disappeared are doing currently in Sri Lanka, out in the streets, forming political communities around the grief of not knowing what has happened to their loved ones, keeping on pressing for information. But it the situation is very bleak. Godabaya Rajapaksha, who had consistently opposed the demands of justice, including commitments made to the UN Human Rights Council, is now at the head. Mahinda Rajapaksa assuming the post of Prime Minister, the power is firmly and disturbingly consolidating between the brothers. With the increase in government surveillance, the Mothers of the Disappeared group has reportedly been unable to hold even a public protest. When the new administration asked these mothers for information about who were part of their meetings, these mothers remind them of their right to information about missing persons. I would always also urge all of you to look at the website of Pearl Action, which documents in detail with photographs the missing, and also those who have passed away, the loved ones, those who have passed away while waiting for the information on their loved ones. Remembering the disappeared, remembering the violence that has happened, also remembering the solidarities and sisterhoods that were formed is the only way to rage against the violence of erasure. I conclude with a poem again by Yalini, translated by Geeta Sukumaran, written at the end of the war. The smell of corpses spreading like smoke. The smell of corpses spreading like smoke, you may encounter it at any moment. Story of wasting bodies, hair bristling, wandering in the village, buried under the reddened quicksand of time, a corpse covered, lay spread out on my bed, a poem ingested. The body entered my throat and sifted my words, flicking off fingers that extend in the dense drizzle of failed northern rain. You keep walking past, my corpses that lay frozen within. unwritten words. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. Thank you so much. I think it was a very fitting tribute to Malati Duyadil, a dear friend of most of us who have been interested in this field. And for me, especially as somebody who has been invested in this topic in many ways, linked to it in an everyday sense, in a way that one has to address it. And many of us who were part of the 80s, 70s generation. And in Tamil Nadu, for us, we needed to take into account this part, take into account the role of Sri Lankan context, especially the ethnic conflict, because they were speaking the same language as us in Tamil Nadu. So anytime you read, talk, discuss, I think it really takes you to a plane where it's very difficult to draw the line, between the affect and the reason that one has to talk about. Thank you so much. I think in a way you captured the momentum. Apart from the factual details, I don't know how many of the listeners have followed closely of Sri Lankan history, which Aparna assumed, and I'm sure in the discussions it would come. Even though the war is supposed to have ended, I think the way Aparna presented tells you that the traces of the war are still continuing. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Aparna. So I think this study of Dr. Aparna is something very, very crucial, because I really see people like us who are bilingual or multilingual and who are writing in a language like Aparna said, her mother tongue is not Tamil, but she's reading Tamil poetry and is interpreting it for an academic world, which in itself is another world altogether, and in English. And I think it's a very, very difficult terrain that one is really traversing through. The journey is not really easy. And especially when it is connected to long drawn out war, be it in Kashmir or Palestine or Sri Lanka, or I'm sure we're going to be talking about Syria in some senses, or the age-old struggles of the first world nations, which keep coming up again and again in the discourses of our anthropological, cultural history and literature. So the idea of having writing as witness or as testimonial has this burden of being a document, being a kind of document where documents are not possible. In a historical sense, if one is going to look for facts, I'm sure already many of those facts, maps have been changed, landscapes have changed, names have been changed. And like Aparna was talking, even just last week, you had memories and memorials being demolished and renamed, and it's a whole lot of other things. And I really loved Gauri's poem that you read about, the war tourism kind of thing, so how do you really do that? And one must remember that in Sri Lanka, with the diasporic population, with a vast diasporic population, the experience that Gauri is talking about is going to be recurrent. It's going to be something that will be there for children in Europe, Canada, and others who may not be able to read Tamil, but they are Tamils. and who are possibly speaking multi-different languages. So Sri Lankan Tamil studies, if ever that comes up, I think it's going to be in many languages. So Aparna, although, I mean, I'm glad you're understanding your position of entry as somebody who is an outsider. But I would not call them pitfalls. I would just call them as challenges, and they are real challenges, you know. And I think we know how to work through it. We can never really just kind of bypass these issues. We are going to work through it. So I just thought I'll flag off one or 2 points and leave it open for discussion. One is the area that Aparna has talked about, focuses on poetry, and poetry as a genre has its own specificities. So if you're going to be a pure, if at all there is a pure literature student, then I think those questions are going to come up. And today, like she talked about Tamarini's memoir, and we have so many memoirs which are coming, not people who are identifying themselves as writers, and sometimes even mediated through workshops, through collective gatherings, you know, so it is partly therapeutic. It is partly their coping mechanism for survival. And more than poetry, it's going to be prose in some form. And not even fiction in many ways. It's going to be so close to life stories, but not necessarily autobiographical, you know, because even Tamarini's repertoire, who is already a writer and an ex-combatant, and who was captured and then spent a lot of years, and then also suffered illness and passed away. And her memoir was published a year after her death. And people are still arguing whether people have tampered with the writing, you know, in the way she has recorded the document. So I don't think we are even going to talk about the truth value of these writings. We are only going to be talking about what does writing really give us. You know, in fact, in Aparna's paper that she circulated, she refers to Anar. You know, so where she says, "Naan paadal enakku kavidai muham." You know, so I'm a song. I'm song, and my face, the poetry is my face. You know, which is what Anar, one of the major Tamil Muslim poets from Sri Lanka, talks about, and Aparna refers to her writings. So I think the question of genre, and I'm sure as Aparna is going to be engaging with this topic furthermore, and I would truly entreat you to do that, because we do need people to know about these writings that are there written in Tamil, and there are few voices who are writing about it from within the Sri Lankan context, be it Cheran or Agilan or even Sumati. But I think there are various standpoints when they write. So in a way, I think the distance that a scholar like you have would really kind of help in bringing out, in teasing out the subtler differences and expression. So it is going to expand, and one of the ways in which it can expand is to really expand it in terms of genre, in terms of incorporating, I mean, which Aparna has already done, whether it is Chitralekha, Sumati writes in both Tamil and English, and there are many more writings that come in Tamil. In Pelmanakkum Poludhu, Chitralekha Mamaguru actually talks about the difficulties of, you know, what gets published in Tamil Nadu, like Pelmanakkum Poludhu. It was so difficult to get it across to Sri Lanka, to Tamil-speaking areas, especially at that time, because it was 2007. So it took about 3-4 years for this book to really reach there. And then there are also mistakes that Tamil-speaking editors and compilers like me or Krishnagiri or Tamilavan, you know, name all of us, we all commit. In fact, even in Pelmanakkum Poludhu, I later came to know that 2 of the women I had included in that were actually men writing in female names. And then, I mean, Chitra herself has many pseudonyms. and that becomes a necessity in times of war when you're referring to various things. So it is a kind of very complex question. So it is good to have many voices, that can really kind of bring up these issues. I also feel the idea of, like you mentioned, the idea of feminist solidarity, which can be built across languages and across ethnicities. And Malati was, there are many. Sunila is there, Kumari is there, and you have Malati, and you mentioned Sarla, who has a very, very checkered history of choosing to live in the eastern part of Sri Lanka. Yeah, that seminar especially was very, very deeply moving. So that kind of feminist solidarity which can be built up, including the poets. There is a recent volume of Ariyal which is yet to come, which is in the pipeline, called Nedumarangalai Vardal, and Nedumarangalai, which he takes from Bharadiyar, where you just stand unable to do anything, where that's a usage he uses in Panjali Sabadam, where he says Nettai Marangalai Pulambahindra, so you stand and just watch. You can't do anything. So that inability to not be able to do any of those anything that you really want to do, and what Arya sees as something that can really hold you together would be writing. Writing as conscience, Manasachi. So this is a poem called Pinnaya Vasippu. I haven't done an official translation, but I can do a rough translation. So it says, Manasachiyai meendum meendum nalliravil eluppum kadavin pinnal. Nobet enadum. Nobet is name of the writer Singaram, who wrote Pudiyador Ulagam, which was one of the earliest writings to really document the beginnings of ethnic violence. So Nobet enadum Rajiniye kaigalum innum tatti chorndu poividavillai. So in other words, Singaram and Rajini are tapping, they keep knocking at the door of your conscience in the middle of the night. So it is the writing that really keeps our conscience alive, according to Ariyal in this poem. But then she also adds, and she says, Dukkame tan muga chayalai padinda Adivasi kiraviyin kangalin pinnalirundu ஒளிந்து கொண்டுதான் இருக்கிறது பெருந்தன்மை எனும் அணையா ஒளிச்சுடர். Roughly it will be the ancestral grandma's eyes, whose face has the trace of suffering, still shines the ever-lit lamp of perundanmai. Can be animals, generous, compassion, so it is still compassion. So somewhere I think the idea of the war and being a witness to the war and suffering, and being the voice, having this burden to document. And I think in a way, as an academician, Dr. Aparna has chosen to be this mediator and bearing the burden of that, and it is not an easy job, like Aparna said. It's not just Manaberigal or Koneshwarigal which is difficult to read because they are a little more graphic, but there are many other texts, where they talk about how their birds today have a surfeit of food because through the water come so many corpses and they feed on them. Or you're somewhere in a land where you don't recognize the trees or the plants or the flowers that are there. But I think women's voices have less of nostalgia, more of survival, more of confidence, more of hope, if I can use the word hope. So I think in that sense, it has always been a difficult when you really kind of work through women's writing, and that ever present idea of how do we write women's, right? How do you include women's writing, or is women's writing creating a rupture in the world of writing? Those questions really come up. But For these women, I think writing is what has kept them alive, whether in their own land or in their own homes, which is not necessarily a home anymore, or somewhere else, in another land, in another country, in another language. So I think writing has really become the anchor, the lifeboat kind of feeling. And then, writing as late as in 2015 in a poem called Salt. Ariel doesn't write as much. I really wanted her to be present in this meeting, and we will share the recording with her. And in that, she kind of, all the metaphors are related to ocean and waves and island and everything. And then she ends it saying, which ocean is going to forget the saltiness? Which mother intends to get children to fight wars? உவர்ப்பை எந்த மாகடல் மறந்து போயிருக்கிறது, எந்த தாய் தன் குழந்தைகளை போருக்காக பெற்றெடுக்கிறார். So it is not, the distance does not really take away the memories. It keeps it alive. And I think apart from the actual memorial sites and everything, the difficulty of facing the state impunity in just remembering your own family members who are gone. All of us have All Souls Day. You remember the people who are dead on every year, annually, the Tithi that you talk about. And that becomes difficult. In fact, Agilan's recent collection, which is getting translated by Geeta Sugumaran, talks about that. So in fact, in one of the plays that we did with the Surya group, so we were talking about different lamps in the house. You have a Kuttuvelakku, you have a Melugutiri, candlelight, you have all these kind of different lights. And then one of the lights that they talked about was Savamillada Savittil Eriyum Kuttuvilakku. There is no corpse, there's no dead body, but it is a house of death. And you light a lamp. Now, even that lighting of lamp for remembrance has come under a lot of threat. It's becoming much more checkered, but I think, I describe myself always as a pathologically optimistic person, so I don't want to give in whether lockdown or, whatever happens. I think we can't afford the luxury of losing hope. That is not there for us. And but we do have the luxury to reflect. We do have the way to really learn, respond, and do that. And I think these academic exercises, and I'm hoping Aparna's thesis would soon become a book, which has been my wish for a few years now, so it will soon come up. So when it comes up, I think it's going to be a rich collection, not just for South Asian studies, but also for women's writing in the rest of the world, especially women's writing in times, in spaces of spaces of conflict, in times of crisis. So I think it is something that we as academicians owe to the society around us, because if you're going to keep going back to what is the role of the intellectual or the academician, I think these are what the least that we can do is to really flesh out and flag the issues that they have documented in some form or the other in at most difficult times. So I think Aparna's job is difficult and it is great, and I know she has a really good mix of academicians, poets, and friends across India, in Tamil Nadu, and in Sri Lanka, and that will keep her going. That will be what I think will keep her going, and I wish her all success, and I'll leave the floor open for discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your kind words.
Yeah. Arunima?
Thank you, Mangai. Thanks a lot for responding to Aparna's rich paper. which is between her paper and your responses, I think we have opened up a range of questions about form, about poetry, about the idea of witnessing, about the idea of unshareability, and what do we do with that question that keeps returning to us, especially as feminists and those who work with the kind of material that we do on the issue of experience. How do we think with that? You know, I particularly would like Aparna to speak a little bit more about this kind of idea of unshareability. I think there is something very specific to that, which is different, and perhaps there's a way in which she is thinking about it differently from the ways in which others who have thought about, experience as some kind of embodied sort of forms of expression and political practice. So it's sort of taking it away from that. So how would we think more about that? So I think there are really very rich areas. Also, I think the question, and I'm really happy Mangai brought this up, because this is something that increasingly most of us living in, I don't think there are any sort of zones of the world anymore which we sort of demarcate as conflict areas. We are living through conflictual times. These are really, really painful, demanding, difficult times. And at times like that, the sort of feeling that you've been living through civil war for 4 decades or more, and there is no resolution, and there are generations that have died, and there are generations that are going to be sort of coming in the future who are written into this past. So the idea of fatigue, I think, is again such a painful reminder of the ways in which, so speaking to our constant kind of trying to reach out to hope. So I understand what Mangai is saying, but at the same time I also feel that there is such a unbearable sense of fatigue, where you feel the same issues are coming up again and again. And when I had the sort of, a real learning experience of reading so much of the poetry coming from Sri Lanka, thanks to Aparna's thesis, one of the things that struck me was the extraordinary and early kind of candor of being able to speak to this question of violence within the community. So it wasn't as though it was a kind of perpetrator versus victim kind of text that was being laid out. There was actually, on the contrary, there was a really, really important way by which they were very early on turning the lens back. So, even though you are speaking about the violence of India and you're speaking about the violence of the sort of Sri Lankan state, but you're also able to speak about intra-combatant violence. You're able to speak about intra-familial violence. How do you speak about the fact that the husband and the shopkeeper and the policeman, there's this kind of spectrum of gazes by which the woman's body is being sort of shaped and molded and reduced, and there's a kind of speechlessness that comes from that, which is what this poetry is putting into words. So what is actually really remarkable, Aparna, is the fact that we have in words a speaking about wordlessness. So how do we actually bring a certain kind of intellectual and political lens onto those kinds of ideas when we read it at times like these? So it would be very nice to hear you respond to the very rich range of questions and thoughts that Mangai had raised for you, and some of these. And may I request all other participants of this workshop paper presentation, to type in their questions so that we will make it simpler by reading it out to Aparna, and she could respond to those. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for those comments. And thank you, Mangai ma'am, also for responding. to my paper. Um, the question of the question of genre that Mangai ma'am has put forward, I find it very fascinating as well as challenging for me right now, because poetry, like a good friend of mine who's, I think here, Agastya, had once told that poetry is a language of its own, in its own, which she understands. And that sort of, it's still in my mind when she said, what she said. So sometimes there are certain genres which you understand much better, and especially when I'm falling out of the language. But also I find that this might be a great moment for me to look for um, collaborative work in a certain way, where like what I can put. Obviously, collaboration again comes with its own politics and its own power structures, etc., as seen in the recent Deepa Mehta whole issue. So that is again a question that I will deal with. But thank you for fronting it out, that the whole life stories, memoirs. I read how Netra Rodriguez in Cheran had sort of, in the preface to Tamilini's memoir, had taken this question of genre. And well, Netra was saying that memoir should be sort of expanded to include even poetry, and that was an idea that struck me. Yes, why even genres can be malleable, and these are constructs that we have made, and how to go through it. But of course, that would need a different kind of equipment, and a different kind of challenge, like you put forth. um, I'm so struck by this poetry written, mediated through workshops. In fact, today, I think today would be a good day to talk about this. When I had visited Maladi ma'am in Sri Lanka, she had given me the small booklet, which was, Arunima ma'am also knows this, which was about mothers front and mothers groups, and there were a lot of poems in it, which was community which was written together. There was just mother's friend. So it was not, the identity is of the collectivity, and together as a collectivity they have authored something. And the question that Arunima ma'am had mentioned about unshareability could be actually something we can read together with this idea of poetry as therapeutic work as well. How does how why is it the medium through which is uh, people who have gone through war has written in? Because even in Pale Manakkum Poluthu, Citralekha Manoru says that people have lost. It was like obviously you're leaving everything, your belongings, and running away. In the midst of it, you can't run away with your poems, but you come back, you try to fish it out, and when you can't, you write from memory. So there is there that sort of it is this witnessing is so important for them. Even Bhanu Bharati, she writes about the in the preface to Piratiyal, I think, where she's talks about how in running to bunker, sometimes she would take letters written to friends or to come. Those are the most important documents. So documentation again, like Pradeep Jagannathan's important work on anticipation of violence, and Siddharthan Maunaguru's um, um, uh, engagement with this work, which is the sort of effect that people have with documents living through war. And can poetry be a document? And the unshareability question is so important. The idea of fatigue, um, uh, that was again something in that FemCon conference, when Rajini was being remembered by her. A small snippet was being shared about her remembrance by her daughter. She said, Narmada. She said that how her mother was was never tired of the fight. That was what kept her different. So that was what was imbibed to the next generation, which again Sarala Emanuel's work, etc., has beautifully taken forward. This idea of you feel the fatigue like in Selvi's works and Shivaram, but these people kept writing. Even in Shivaramani's work, you see how, even when there was lot of lament of the time that is lost, there's again a glimmer of hope where she's saying that I'll be like that small star which between your fingers which you cannot catch. So it would be something that I can work forward with. And true, like how they have started with the community in the 80s, when you're thinking about forming a different nation for yourself, you're fighting the fight, you would want to keep so much as secretive, but these women were, that was not where they started. That is a lesson for all of us in our personal lives and in our political lives, to shun silence of that sort. I will keep all the comments that I've got today, and I'll rework on it. I'll keep thinking on it, especially regarding genre and unshareability much further. Thank you.
Actually, I think there is that poem on Maunam that you mentioned, no? I'm forgetting the author, where she talks about that it is the silences that become poetry. So in many ways, I think somewhere the silences and the gaps actually become in one of Vijay Lakshmi's poems, she says, Samudayathin nisattamo bayangara iraichalaai something en nimmadiyai kedukkirathu. So it is that silence which is actually loud. and that somehow it enables a shareability, in some ways, the pauses, the gaps and everything. Thank you, Aparna.
I also think that, because, I mean, just to go back to this question of where we all are, even say a decade back or a couple of decades back, I think the subcontinental political situation was slightly different. Now I think things are just horrible everywhere. There is again a need probably out across borders and boundaries and build and rebuild. And perhaps that's what a younger generation of feminists is doing now. I think it's extremely important to bring back those linkages, which certainly people of my generation or older will remember, having been connected to feminist friends, both whether they were in academics, and actually I think the boundaries there were also not so tight. I mean, you would have been part of political groups and you may have been there in the classroom, or you may have been a cultural, sort of somebody who's culturally active. And certainly in Sri Lanka, one can see that. I mean, I know so many artists, for example, whose work, people work with words and visuals, and, there are ways in which they think about that. I had an extraordinary experience of being able to actually hear Cheran live last year when he had come to the Kerala Literary Festival in Kozhikode. And it's soon after that COVID started and the lockdown started and so on. So I think it is actually a moment where perhaps one can have productive kinds of relationships forged once again. And I think intellectual work is so important. I mean, we constantly feel guilty about intellectual labor, but there is an enormous amount that can be done with intellect work, especially if it's put out there for people to read, and also for people to teach with, and for us to sort of redo ways in which we think about classrooms. So thank you very much, Aparna. It was an excellent talk. Thank you.
In fact, the mothers of the disappeared, like Aparna was describing. I mean, Vasugi, who did the painting for Payal Manakkum, and she's one of our early painters that Aparna also talks about, Arundhati and Vasugi. So now what Vasuki is doing is to work with these mothers on saris, and they paint the shape of the women and give the details of the person, the day they were lost, from which path and all that. So it is literally converting the idea of your body as a map and to give it, and to do it on. So it's a. I really think we along. It is a way of healing, and one has to really think of healing. So, however, I mean, I get the word fatigue, loud and clear, Arunima. But I'm also thinking the way people are looking at whether it is anti-CAA struggle or the farmers' struggle now. I'm thinking how library becomes part of the struggle space. Langar becomes part of the struggle space.
Absolutely.
So there is a way in which I think we are imagining an ethics of care in struggle. So in a way it is kind of it is a healing. It is the healing that is going to keep us going with all the fatigue that we are going through. So when one falls, the other gives a shoulder. Yeah. Yeah.
Rachel, would you like to read out the comments, please?
Yes. Um, Hi, Aparna. We have a few appreciatory remarks for your talk, and I would read out this one comment from, I think the person is SL Poetry, that's the name written. I'm researching and identifying sites of trauma within poems themselves and the effect of these sites on the translators who experience them in such a visceral way. Your paper was so informative and rich in bibliographic material. Would you like to add something on to that particular aspect?
Geeta Sukumaran's work, I think, deals a lot with the idea of trauma and within poetry. And you are right. I mean, there are a lot of poems which are, like Mangai ma'am was saying, it's very difficult to read because you have like blood notes by Anar, or the idea of mental breakdown mapped onto poems, and talking of corpses, talking about being removed from reality. It is difficult, but I wouldn't say on the translators, but readers. And I think that is what poetry is trying to do also. Like the whole unshareability question comes again. Like the term that Sumati Shivamohan had used when she was talking to me was about translationality of experience. Aparna, maybe you can learn the language, but how will you cross over that bump? So why are we getting affected reading translations? Like what transpires to us through poetry, and how is it different perhaps from other genres, is a question which is very interesting. And I would Shash Trevet, I'm working with your so again, I'll be looking forward to read your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. We have a few messages appreciating your talk from Jinu GV and Hamida CK also, but there are no further queries in the chat box. Professor Arunima, shall we conclude the session?
Sure. And I think perhaps we can continue our conversations outside of this formal kind of space. And if people want to get together and talk about war and poetry and other such things, we can certainly try and get together and do that, because I think that's so needed in these times. And I fully agree with Mangai that, we are really looking at so many new kinds of sites of protest and resistance, but also of extraordinary kinds of, I'm always thrown by the kinds of cultural energy, which, for instance, the farmers' protest is a great example once again of how that's brought together, brought brought out all forms of cultural forms of resistance, which don't necessarily map onto the ways in which, say, speeches or prose might position itself. So once again, what a pleasure to listen to a talk on poetry. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
Aparna. Thank you, Arunima. Pleasure. Such a pleasure.
Bye, Mangai. Talk to you soon.
Yes. Bye.